Before we begin, take a breath, because what you are about to hear is not the kind of story you rush through. It is the kind of story you sit with, the kind that finds something quiet in you and stays there long after the screen goes dark. If you believe that love can survive time, that the people we carry in our hearts never fully leave us, and that some reunions are simply meant to happen no matter how many years stand between them, this story is for you. And if you are new here, please take one moment right now to hit that like button and subscribe, because this channel exists for exactly these stories, the ones that are so deeply, completely human that they remind you why being human is worth it. What happened on that Family Feud stage in the summer of 2024 did not just silence a room full of people who thought they were there to watch a game show. It silenced something inside each of them, something that needed to be quiet for a moment. Something that needed to listen. Stay with us. From the very first word to the very last, this story deserves your full attention. There is a particular kind of grief that nobody writes greeting cards for. It is not the grief of death, which has rituals and casseroles and a somewhat understood timeline and people who know to call. It is not the grief of a clean ending, where the loss is sharp and defined, and you know exactly what you are mourning and why. It is the grief of the open question. The grief of not knowing. The grief that lives in the space between what you know happened and what you don't know happened next, a space that has no edges and no bottom and no reliable way to measure its depth. It is the grief that keeps its coat on. The grief that never fully moves in because it is always, in some unspoken part of itself, waiting for a reason to leave. For 63-year-old Franklin Edwards of Birmingham, Alabama, that grief had lived in the space between December 1984 and every day that came after it. The space between the last time he held his daughter and every morning he had woken up since then, which was approximately 14,600 mornings, none of which had passed without the weight of that open question pressing somewhere in his chest in a way he had learned to breathe around, but never learned to make lighter. Her name was Clara. She was 7 months old the last time he held her. She had a small birthmark on the inside of her left wrist, a little crescent shape, the color of weak tea. She had her mother's nose and Franklin's ears and the particular baby smell that he had read somewhere is biological, designed by evolution to trigger caregiving instincts in adults, though Franklin did not need evolution's help. He was 23 years old, and he had never wanted anything the way he wanted to be a good father to this child. He had not been prepared for her, not in the practical sense. He and Clara's mother Denise were young, and the relationship had been unsteady in the way of young relationships that have not yet figured out their own weight. But unprepared is not the same as unwilling. From the moment he held Clara in the hospital, Franklin Edwards had been entirely, irreversibly willing. The relationship with Denise had not survived the pressures of young parenthood and financial strain, and two people who loved each other in ways that were real but not yet mature enough to build something lasting on. They separated when Clara was 4 months old. It was not a violent separation, not a dramatic one. It was the quiet, grinding kind, the kind that happens slowly and then all at once, the kind that leaves both people standing in the wreckage wondering exactly when the collapse began. Franklin had believed, had been told, had understood that he would have access to Clara. That whatever happened between him and Denise, Clara was his daughter and he was her father, and that was not something that ended with a relationship. What happened next is a story that is, unfortunately, not uncommon, though its frequency does nothing to reduce its specific cruelty. Denise's family had moved. Then Denise had moved. Phone numbers changed in the way phone numbers changed in 1984, before the digital era made people findable in ways they had not consented to. Franklin was young and working 2 jobs and did not have money for lawyers, and the people around him were not people who had experienced navigating family court systems. He wrote letters. Some were returned. Some were not. He made calls to numbers that rang out or were answered by people who did not know where Denise had gone. He spent 8 months doing everything he knew how to do with the resources he had, and at the end of those 8 months, he was 24 years old and he had a daughter somewhere in the world and no way to reach her, and the particular helplessness of that, the specific, grinding helplessness of loving someone you cannot find, had begun to settle into him like weather, the kind that changes the climate of a person rather than passing through. He did not stop loving Clara. That is the thing that needs to be said clearly and without qualification. Franklin Edwards did not stop loving his daughter for a single day in 40 years. He built a life, a real one, a good one, the kind of life a person builds when they decide that grief does not get to be the only thing. He married a woman named Loretta when he was 28, a steady, generous woman who knew about Clara from their second date because Franklin was not the kind of man who hid the things that mattered most to him. Loretta had listened to him tell it and had not looked away and had said, simply and directly, "We will find her." Not right away. They were young and working class, and finding people in the late 1980s was genuinely difficult in ways that are hard to explain to anyone who did not live in that era. But eventually, "We will find her." Franklin had looked at this woman and understood that he was going to marry her, not only because she said that, but because of the way she said it, not as a promise she was making to comfort him, but as a fact she was stating because she believed it was true. They had two sons. Marcus, born in 1990, and Devin, born in 1993. Franklin was present for every part of their growing up in the way that he had always intended to be present for Clara's growing up, and there was a bittersweet quality to his fatherhood that his boys eventually understood and accepted, and in their own way, honored. They knew about Clara before they were old enough to fully understand what her absence meant. They grew up knowing they had a sister somewhere. It was not a dramatic revelation or a carefully managed disclosure. It was simply part of the furniture of their family, present and acknowledged and taken seriously, the way Franklin had always taken it seriously. Clara's birthday, August 14th, was noted every year. Not with a party or a ritual exactly, just noted, remembered, held. Franklin had searched in the ways available to him in each decade, letters in the 80s, newspaper notices that nobody answered. A private investigator in 1997 who took $3,000 Franklin did not easily have and returned 6 months later with a name change and a cold trail. Online searches beginning in the early 2000s, which produced several women of the right age with the right first name in the right general region of the country, none of whom were his daughter. A DNA testing service in 2018, when Franklin was 57, and Loretta had insisted with the particular insistence of a woman who has watched her husband carry something for 30 years and has decided that enough is enough. The DNA test had produced matches, distant ones, cousins of cousins, the genealogical equivalent of a trail that shows someone walked this way once, but does not tell you where they went. Enough to confirm that he had the right biological pool. Not enough to find her. What it had produced, unbeknownst to Franklin, was a flag. A marker in a database that would sit quietly for 5 years until a woman in Memphis, Tennessee, taking the same test for her own reasons, produced a match that the algorithm identified as close enough to be significant. A match that a genetic genealogist, hired by a Family Feud producer named Raymond who had been working on this specific case for 7 months, was able to trace to a 41-year-old woman named Clara Simmons who had been born Clara Edwards on August 14, 1984, and who had a small crescent-shaped birthmark on the inside of her left wrist. Clara Simmons, Clara Edwards, had grown up not knowing her father's last name with certainty. She had been told in the way children of complicated situations are sometimes told things, a version of her origins that was incomplete in the specific places that would have made finding Franklin easier. She was not told lies exactly. She was told a partial truth by a mother who had her own grief and her own reasons, and who was, by the time Clara was old enough to ask serious questions, herself a woman shaped by things that had happened, and things she wished had not. Clara had grown up loved. She had grown up in a stable home with a stepfather who treated her well, and was the practical father of her childhood in all the ways that mattered day to day. She had not spent her life in obvious distress about the biological father she didn't know. She was a functioning, stable, self-aware adult, a nurse in Memphis, 41 years old, with 2 teenage children of her own and a marriage of 16 years and a life that was full and real and genuinely hers. But there is something that adult adoptees and children of absent parents often describe, something that Clara had described to a therapist she saw briefly in her 30s, a feeling not of emptiness exactly, but of incompleteness, like a sentence that is grammatically correct, but is missing a word you keep thinking should be there, a word whose absence you would not necessarily notice in ordinary reading, but that you feel every time you read it carefully. She had taken the DNA test in the spring of 2023 on something close to a whim, or what feels like a whim from the outside, but is usually, when examined more carefully, the result of a long, slow accumulation of quiet wanting that finally reaches the weight of an action. She had not told her husband or her children she was doing it. She was not sure what she was looking for. She was not sure she was looking for anything. She just swabbed the inside of her cheek and sent it in and went back to her life, and did not check the results for 3 weeks because checking them required a kind of readiness she was not sure she had. When she checked them, she found the distant cousins and the cold trail and one flagged close match that the platform said was consistent with a first-degree relative. She had stared at that flag for a long time. Then she had closed the laptop and made dinner and helped her youngest with homework and said nothing to anyone. And then, at 11:30 that night, she had opened the laptop again and looked at it some more. Raymond, the producer, had reached Clara 4 months before Franklin's Family Feud taping. He had not reached her directly at first. He had gone through the genetic genealogist, who had gone through a family connection, who had established contact carefully and without pressure. When Clara finally spoke to Raymond on the phone, she was quiet for a long time after he explained what he was proposing. Then she asked 2 questions. The first, "Is he healthy?" The second, "Does he know I'm alive?" Raymond answered both honestly. Franklin was healthy. Franklin knew she was alive in the sense that he had never been certain she wasn't, had never had a confirmed death to grieve, had simply been left in the open question for 40 years. Raymond did not tell her about the 14,600 mornings. He told her enough. Clara said she needed 2 weeks to think. Raymond said, of course, she called back in 4 days. The logistics of what followed required the same care that all these productions required: the grief counselors, the trauma specialists, the rehearsal of every possible emotional outcome, the preparation of both parties in ways that acknowledged the complexity of what they were walking into without making it so clinical that the humanity drained out of it. Franklin was told that the show had arranged a special surprise for him after the game, something personal, something that required privacy and care. He was told it was good news. He asked, with the directness of a man who had learned not to leave important questions unasked. "How good?" Raymond had looked at him and said. "The best." Franklin had nodded slowly and not asked any more questions, and Raymond had watched something happen in Franklin's face that he would describe later as watching a man pick up something he had been afraid to hope for and hold it, just for a moment, just to feel its weight. The day of the taping, Franklin Edwards arrived at the studio with Loretta, Marcus, Devon, and Devon's wife, Keisha. He was dressed in a gray suit that Loretta had pressed the night before with the focused attention she brought to all things that mattered. He was calm in the way he was always calm, the deep, practiced calm of a man who has carried weight for a long time and knows how to carry it without letting it show in his face. He shook hands with everyone. He complimented the production staff. He sat in the green room and drank the coffee that was offered and made conversation with genuine warmth and present attention. Loretta sat beside him with her hand in his, as she had been sitting for 35 years, steady and certain and entirely there. Marcus and Devon knew. They had been told 3 days before the taping because Franklin and Loretta's family did not do secrets within itself, not about things this large. Marcus, who was 34 and had his father's calm exterior and his mother's ability to read a room, had spent those 3 days in a kind of quiet, private awe at what was about to happen. Devon, who was 31 and more openly emotional than his brother, had cried when Loretta told them, and had then composed himself and said, with a simplicity that cut straight to the center of the thing, 40 years. Dad's been waiting 40 years. And then he had looked at his father, at the man who had told him about Clara before he was old enough to understand, who had noted August 14th every year without fail, who had carried the open question with such consistent grace that Devon had grown up thinking it was possible to love someone you had never met with the same loyalty you gave the people in the room with you every day. And he had said nothing more because there was nothing more to say. On stage, the Edwards family was exactly what you would expect from a family shaped by that particular combination of warmth, humor, resilience, and the specific comfort of people who have been through things together and come out the other side still choosing each other. They played with energy and generosity. Franklin was quietly excellent, precise, and thoughtful in his answers, light enough to get laughs, grounded enough that the audience trusted him from the first minute. Steve Harvey, who had been briefed fully and was operating in the same double mode he had operated in before, present as a host, present as a witness, found himself enjoying the game in a way that was genuine even alongside the weight of what he knew was coming. "This man," Steve said at one point, gesturing at Franklin with the microphone, "has got something. I don't know what it is, but this man has got something." The audience applauded. Franklin smiled in the moderate, self-possessed way of someone who has never needed the room to look at him to know who he is. Loretta, in the audience, held her own face very carefully for the entire game. She had been offered the option of being on stage with the family but had chosen to be in the audience, for a reason she explained to Raymond simply. "This moment is his. I want to watch him have it." She sat in the third row in a lavender dress she had bought specifically for this day, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes on her husband, steady as she had always been steady. For 35 years, the fixed point around which Franklin's life had organized itself when other things shifted. When the game ended and Steve asked the family to stay, Franklin went still in a way that was different from his usual stillness. Not tenser, stiller. The stillness of someone who has spent 40 years preparing for a moment they were not sure would come and now feels, in some part of themselves that is below language, that it might be about to. He looked at Steve Harvey with those calm, deep eyes and said nothing. Steve looked back at him for a moment before speaking. "Franklin," Steve said, "I have been doing this job for a long time. I have had the privilege of being part of some moments on this stage that I will carry for the rest of my life. And I want to tell you before anything else that what I am about to give you, what this show has had the honor of putting together, is something I do not take lightly, something none of us take lightly." He paused. "You have been looking for someone for 40 years. Franklin's jaw tightened slightly, just slightly, the smallest possible external evidence of a very large internal event. "We found her," Steve said. "Franklin, we found Clara." The sound Franklin Edwards made was not loud. It was barely audible past the first row. It was the sound of a man whose body has just received news that his mind has been waiting 4 decades to process. A sound that came from somewhere so deep and so private that it seemed almost wrong that anyone else was in the room for it. He pressed both hands flat on the podium in front of him, as if he needed something solid. His head dropped forward slightly. His shoulders, which had been straight and square the entire taping, curved inward, not in defeat, but in the way that the body curves around something precious, the instinctive protective posture of a person cradling something they cannot afford to drop. Marcus, standing beside him, put his hand on his father's back without saying a word. Devon, on his other side, took his father's arm. Franklin stood between his 2 sons and breathed, once, twice. Then he lifted his head. "She's here." His voice was barely a voice. It was more like the shape of a question. "She's here," Steve said. Clara Simmons walked out from the side of the stage. She was a tall woman, composed in the professional way of nurses who have learned to be present in rooms where things are uncertain and someone needs to be the calm one. She was wearing a deep blue dress. Her hair was natural and pulled back. She walked with the deliberate, careful pace of someone who is managing her own body, because if she does not manage it, she is not sure what it will do. Her hands were clasped in front of her, and on the inside of her left wrist, just visible below the edge of her sleeve, was a small crescent-shaped birthmark the color of weak tea. Franklin saw it immediately. Before her face registered fully, before his mind had assembled all the pieces into the complete certainty he had been waiting for, his eyes found that birthmark and everything in him that had been held in careful suspension for 40 years released at once. He made a sound. Then he was moving, and it was not the movement of a 63-year-old man with a measured, controlled affect. It was something more ancient than that, something below personality and learned behavior, the movement of a father toward his child, as basic and as unstoppable as anything in the physical world. Clara saw him coming, and she stopped pretending she was composed. Her face changed completely. Not into grief, not into happiness, not into any single emotion, but into something that was all of them at once. An expression that had no clean name because it had never been needed before. The expression of a person who has found the missing word in the sentence they have been reading their whole life, and now can finally, at 41 years old, read it completely. She moved toward him. They closed the distance between them the way distances between the right people always close, inevitably, completely, as if the distance itself had only been temporary and had been waiting for this permission to end. When Franklin Edwards put his arms around his daughter for the first time in 40 years, the room went silent. Not the polite silence of an audience managing its response. Not the hushed silence of people trying not to intrude. The involuntary silence of an entire room of human beings simultaneously confronted with something too large for noise. The sound simply stopped, as if the air itself had decided to pay attention, as if the ordinary acoustic life of the space had paused to make room for what was happening in the middle of it. 40 years collapsed into a single point of contact, a father's arms around his daughter's shoulders, her face against his chest, his chin resting on the top of her head in the way parents hold children, in the way the body remembers holding even when the mind has had to stop counting on the opportunity. He closed his eyes. He held her with both arms, and he held her with the 40 years, and he held her with every August 14th, and every returned letter, and every sleepless calculation, and every morning that had begun with the open question pressing in his chest and ended without an answer. He held all of it, and she held him back, and the room stayed silent and stayed silent and stayed silent. Steve Harvey stood to one side. His face was entirely undone. There was no host in that moment. just a man watching something that had broken him open in a way that he would later say, in the quietest interview he ever gave about any moment on his show, felt like a privilege so large it was almost unbearable. "I have cried on that stage before," he said. "I have been moved before. But this was different, because this was 40 years. This was a man who had held that love for 40 years without any place to put it. And watching him finally put it somewhere, he stopped. He was quiet for a moment. There are no words for that. I am someone who makes his living with words, and I am telling you, there are no words for that." When Franklin and Clara finally separated enough to look at each other, it was Clara who spoke first. She took his left hand in both of hers and turned it palm up, looking at it, and said, "I have your hands." It was a simple statement, an observation, the kind of thing people say when they are meeting their biology for the first time and finding it both strange and deeply familiar. But it was also more than that. It was Clara Simmons, 41 years old, confirming to herself what some part of her had already known, what the missing word in the sentence had always been. She had his hands. She had come from somewhere. The somewhere had a face, and it was right here, and it was looking at her with eyes that had been looking for her for 40 years and had finally found what they were looking for. Franklin looked at her hands holding his. Then he looked at the birthmark on her wrist. He touched it lightly with one finger, just touched it, barely contact at all, the way you touch something you have been picturing for a very long time and are still not entirely certain is real. "I used to describe this to people," he said quietly. "When I was looking for you, I used to say she has a birthmark, small, crescent-shaped, inside the left wrist, like a little moon." He paused. "I was afraid I was going to forget the details. I made myself describe it every year so I wouldn't forget." Clara looked at the birthmark, then she looked at her father. "You didn't forget," she said. Franklin shook his head. "No," he said, "I didn't forget anything." Steve Harvey had moved closer while they spoke, and now he was near enough that the three of them formed a loose circle, the way people stand when they are part of something rather than observing it. He looked at Franklin, then at Clara, then back at Franklin, and when he spoke his voice had the quality of someone who is speaking from the place in himself where things are real rather than performed. "Franklin," he said, 40 years ago something was taken from you, not by anyone in this room. Not by anything you did or didn't do. Life took it from you the way life sometimes does, without asking and without explaining. And you did something that a lot of people in that situation don't manage to do." He paused. "You stayed open, you kept looking, you kept loving someone you couldn't reach, and you kept going. You built something beautiful, that family out there, those boys, that woman in the lavender dress who has held your hand through all of it." He paused again, and in the audience Loretta pressed her lips together and looked directly ahead, blinking steadily. "And you never used the pain as a reason to close. That is not a small thing. That is one of the rarest things I know." He turned to Clara. "And you? You took a test on what felt like a whim, and you waited 3 weeks to look at the results, and when you saw what was there you sat with it for a night, and then you opened the laptop and you looked again. Because some part of you knew. Some part of you has always known that the sentence wasn't finished." Clara nodded, her jaw tight. "You had a whole life," Steve continued. "A real, full, good life, and you still felt the missing word, and you were brave enough to go looking for it." He paused. "You found each other. 40 years later, from opposite ends of the same silence, you found each other. And I have the enormous, humbling privilege of being the person standing in this room when it happened." Loretta was brought to the stage a few minutes later. She walked out in her lavender dress with the steady, unrushed pace of a woman who has been waiting for 35 years for this specific moment, and has always known, in the bone-deep way of people who commit fully to things, that it was going to come. She looked at Clara for a long moment. Clara looked back at her. Then Loretta opened her arms and Clara walked into them, and Loretta held the stepdaughter she had never met the way she had always held the things Franklin loved, completely, without reservation, as if they were already hers. Which, in every way that mattered, they always had been. Marcus and Devin came to the stage after that, 2 brothers meeting a sister. 3 people who had grown up in the same house with the same knowledge, that there was a Clara somewhere, that her birthday was August 14th, that their father noted it every year, and who were now standing in front of her in a television studio in the summer of 2024, completing a family that had been waiting to be complete for 4 decades. Devin, who was the more openly emotional of the two, said almost immediately, "We knew about you. Our whole lives we knew about you." Clara looked at him. "What?" Devin nodded. "Dad told us, he always told us, he always said, you have a sister, her name is Clara, she's out there somewhere." Clara turned to look at Franklin. Franklin met her eyes. "You were always my daughter," he said simply. "You were always part of this family. It didn't matter that you weren't in the room." The moment after he said that, the 5 seconds of silence that followed, during which Clara looked at her father and understood the full weight of what he had just told her, was described by Steve Harvey as the moment in the taping where he came closest to losing his composure entirely. He told her she was always in the family, Steve said later, that she'd always been part of it even when she wasn't there, and I watched her receive that. I watched a 41-year-old woman receive the information that she had been loved and included and counted from a distance for 40 years. And something in her face, something just settled. Like a question that had been held at tension finally got an answer and could rest. He paused. I will see that face for the rest of my life. In the year following the taping, Franklin and Clara built what they both described, carefully and without sentimentality, as a relationship rather than a reunion. Because reunion implies a return to something that was, and what they were building had never existed before. It was new, constructed piece by piece from scratch, with all the uncertainty and careful negotiation that new things require. They spoke on the phone once a week and visited in person every 6 weeks or so, alternating between Birmingham and Memphis. Clara brought her children to meet their grandfather, and Franklin met his grandchildren with the particular reverence of a man receiving something he had given up calculating whether he would receive. Her son, 15-year-old Jordan, had Franklin's calm exterior. Her daughter, 13-year-old Amani, had the Edwards family laugh, the full-face laugh, the one that takes over completely, the one that Franklin recognized with a physical shock of recognition the first time he heard it. Clara and Loretta developed a relationship that Clara later described as one of the most unexpected gifts of the entire experience. She had not known what to expect from the woman who had been married to her father for 35 years, who had raised 2 sons and held a family together, and was, in a very real sense, the person most responsible for the fact that Franklin had not been destroyed by 40 years of open question grief. What she found was a woman who had simply decided 35 years earlier that Clara was part of her family and who had never undecided it. She knew my birthday, Clara told a reporter in an interview 6 months after the taping. She didn't tell me that right away. She told me later when we were sitting at her kitchen table. She said, we marked August 14th every year. We never missed it. And I sat there and I thought for 40 years this woman I had never met was noting my birthday, holding space for me, knowing I existed and mattering it. She paused. That is not a small thing. That is, I don't know what you call that. I just know it changed something in me to know it. Franklin planted a tree in his backyard the autumn after the taping. A peach tree. Clara had mentioned in one of their early phone calls that peaches were her favorite. A detail so ordinary and so precious that Franklin had written it down in the small notebook he had been keeping for 40 years. The notebook that had begun as a place to record the things he knew about his daughter, and had slowly, over decades, become something more like a letter he was writing to the future. The peach tree, he told Loretta when he planted it, was for the 40 years of August 14th. One tree for all of them. Loretta had said that was exactly right. Then she had gone inside and come back with 2 glasses of sweet tea, and they had sat on the back porch in the late afternoon and watched the light change and not said anything much. Because after 35 years some silences are not empty, they are full. They are the most full they have ever been. Steve Harvey closed his interview about this story the way he closes all the conversations that matter most to him, not with a summary or a lesson or a neatly packaged takeaway, but with an image. He said, I keep thinking about that moment when he touched the birthmark, just barely touched it with one finger, the thing he had been describing to people for 40 years so he wouldn't forget, and it was right there. It had been right there the whole time in the world on her wrist, real and unchanged, exactly as he remembered it. He was quiet for a moment. Love does that, he said finally. It keeps the details, it holds on to the small things, it doesn't let go of the crescent-shaped birthmark or the baby smell or the August 14th or any of it. It just holds it, for as long as it needs to, until there's somewhere to put it. He paused one last time. Franklin Edwards held it for 40 years. And then he put it down, and it was exactly as real and as true as the day he picked it up. That is the thing worth taking out of this room and into your own life. Not the spectacle of the reunion, though it was one of the most powerful things this show has ever had the privilege of being part of. Not the statistics of how many people watched the clip, or how many DNA tests were ordered in the weeks after it aired, or how many comments were left by people who recognized something of their own story in Franklin's. What is worth taking is the simpler, harder, more permanent truth underneath all of it. That the love you are holding for someone you cannot reach is not wasted. It is not foolish. It is not a symptom of something that needs to be fixed. It is the most human thing you can do, and it is also, as Franklin Edwards proved in 40 years of quiet, faithful, unwavering love, the most durable thing in the world. More durable than distance. More durable than silence. More durable than 40 years of open questions and returned letters and cold trails and November mornings when the weight in your chest is heavier than usual and you breathe around it and you get up anyway. The birthmark was always there. The daughter was always real. The love was never lost. It was just waiting for the morning it could finally put its coat down and stay. If this story moved you today, and we believe it did, we believe it found something in you that needed to be found, please give it a like and subscribe so you never miss a story like Franklin and Clara's. Share it with someone in your life who is holding a love they are afraid to keep hoping for. Because the most important thing this story leaves behind is not the reunion. It is the 40 years before it. It is the proof that loving faithfully in the dark without guarantee, without closure, without anything to hold onto except the fact of the love itself is enough. It has always been enough. It will always be enough. Thank you for sitting with this story today. We will see you in the next one.